Good evening and welcome to our webinar on reasonable accommodations in employment. My name is Debbie Leone and I am the Information Services Manager for the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota. And before we get going here, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So bear with me for just a moment. Okay, hopefully now you are able to see me okay. Yes, this webinar is provided by the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota, and we are a local nonprofit organization that serves the entire state of Minnesota as well as the eastern part of North Dakota. EFMN is an affiliate of the National Epilepsy Foundation. A few little housekeeping items before we get to the heart of what we'll be talking about tonight. The first thing I want to let you know is that this is a 1-hour webinar. To allow for the best possible quality, we do ask that you close out of any other applications or any other windows that you might have open on your computer if you're on a computer, especially for music or video streaming. And that also applies to any others in your household who may also be using the webinar. It'll just give you a better experience if you're out of those extra windows. We don't have the capability to provide technical support during the webinar. So if you do experience difficulties, you might try leaving the webinar and then logging back in using the same link you were originally provided. Sometimes that helps get things going again. We will be sending out certificates of attendance within 3 business days in a follow-up email, along with a copy of this PowerPoint. And the webinar is going to be posted, it is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website for future viewing options. So if you do have technical difficulties and you're unable to get back in, please know that you will be able to access this on our website at a future date. You should be able to see me right now, but we have turned off video for the participants. So I am not able to see you. That is sometimes a question that people are concerned about. So no, I cannot see you right now. You will be able to ask questions during the webinar by clicking on the Q&A icon that's located at the bottom center of your screen. Then a box will pop up and you'll be able to type your question in there and hit send. Now, we are not monitoring questions throughout the webinar. They will be held until the end, but we do ask and encourage you to ask questions during the webinar as they occur to you. That helps us to make the best use of our time at the end to answer as many questions as possible instead of waiting while people type in their questions at the last minute. So please feel free, ask those questions as we go and we'll get to them at the end. And to avoid any confusion, the chat feature, which is next to the Q&A, that has been disabled, and so you won't be able to accidentally hit that instead of the Q&A button. As I said, my name is Debbie Leone, and I am the Information Services Manager at EFMN. In my role, I spend most of my time on the phone and on the computer answering emails and answering phone calls from people who are living with epilepsy or whose lives have been affected by epilepsy in some way, and by providing information and referrals on a wide range of topics related to epilepsy. So if you do ever have any questions or you need resources, please don't hesitate to contact me. My contact information is right there. A few objectives tonight. I just want to let you know what it is you can expect out of the webinar. By attending this webinar, we expect that you'll be able to recognize how the Americans with Disabilities Act, known as the ADA, provides protections in the workplace. You'll understand what the definition is of a reasonable accommodation. You'll be able to identify some examples of possible accommodations that employees specifically with epilepsy might be able to get in the workplace. You'll know how to request an accommodation, and you'll learn what to do if, for some reason, an employer were to deny a requested accommodation. But before we get into all that, I want to start out with a poll question here, just to kind of see who we have with us tonight. So I'm going to pull this poll up. And just, if you could, click on whichever of these most relates to you in terms of your relationship to epilepsy. whether you have epilepsy yourself, maybe you have a family member, a child, a parent. It just is nice if we can see who, where our attendees are coming from. So I'll give you just a few seconds to vote on that. And some people, I understand, do have multiple relationships to epilepsy. So if you just want to pick the one that is the most closely related to your reason for attending this particular webinar, I guess. Okay. Give you just a few more seconds. Okay. And we will share the results. And it looks like it's about halfway split between people who have epilepsy themselves and people who work with people with epilepsy. So that's always good for me to know. We appreciate those of you who are out there working to help people in the epilepsy community, as well as those of you who have epilepsy yourself. So thank you for taking part in that poll. Okay, so let's move forward now. We'll start out just with a little bit of an overview about the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is a federal law, and it prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities under 5 separate titles. Now, each title covers a different area, and those include employment, state and local government, public accommodations like restaurants and other places of business, telecommunications, and then they have a title that covers miscellaneous provisions. In this webinar, we're going to focus only on Title I, which is what covers employment practices under the ADA. The ADA covers all employers with at least 15 employees, and that's important to remember because sometimes people may have difficulties with an employer and they think they're being discriminated against under the ADA. But if that employer has fewer than 15 employees, then they are not required to comply with the requirements of the ADA. There are state laws that do also protect against discrimination, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the webinar. And those will help cover those who aren't covered by the ADA. And then the other thing to know is that every aspect of employment is included in the ADA. So a lot of times people think of it just as, being on the job and an employer not being able to discriminate against a current employee. But there are the ADA requirements also extend into the recruitment process, the application process, interviewing, hiring, training, equal access to promotions and benefits. So there's more to it than just that business of not being able to be fired due to a disability. So it's important to know that the protections are there in a wide aspect of employment. So what is disability under the ADA? When we hear the word disability, it has a different definition under different programs, particularly when it comes to the government. So for the ADA, a disability is defined as, a person with a disability is defined as one who has a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, as well as those who with a record of having such an impairment or who are regarded as having such an impairment. So this is a much broader definition than what is used, for example, to determine eligibility for Social Security disability. There is no list of specific medical conditions within the ADA that they don't have a list that says here are the different medical conditions that are covered. Instead, what they look at are specific limitations on a person's abilities. But that being said, individuals with epilepsy generally are going to be covered under the ADA because of the potential limitations that exist were they to have a seizure. So what is a reasonable accommodation? It's defined as any change in the workplace or in the way things are usually done that provides equal opportunities for those with disabilities to apply for a job, to perform a job, or to enjoy equal access to the benefits of the job. So for an employee with epilepsy, these changes may be needed because of the epilepsy itself, the effects of anti-seizure medication, or both. It's important to know that accommodations are not designed to give those with disabilities any special privileges or any advantages in the workplace. They're meant to level the playing field so that people with disabilities, including epilepsy, have equal opportunity for gainful employment to those who do not have disabilities. So what does the employer have to do in regard to reasonable accommodations under the ADA? An employer has to make reasonable accommodations for qualified individuals, which is defined as someone who can perform the essential functions of the job, either with or without accommodations. The second part of that is they have to provide those accommodations unless to do so would cause an undue burden on the employer. So that's a lot of stuff in there to unpack. So let's talk first about qualified individuals. What that means is that to be a qualified individual, you have to have the skills, the education, and the knowledge required to do the job. If, for example, you want to work as an accountant and the job requires a degree, a college degree in accounting, and you don't have that, then you can't claim discrimination under the ADA because you're not qualified for that job in the first place. So, and it's not just college or education, it can also be needing a certain minimum years of experience in a certain job role, competency with a specific type of equipment or computer program. Very often where you'll find these qualifications that would make you a qualified individual is going to be in the job description, which is why you will see, in a job description, must be proficient in using Microsoft Word, or must have so many years of experience using a drill press, or whatever the job is. There's always going to be qualifications, and in order to be qualified, you have to be able to meet those first and foremost before your disability is even considered. The second part of this is the essential functions, and that refers to the fundamental duties that the employee has to do in order to perform the job. Again, very often they are listed in the job description, but there's kind of some gray areas in there. And one example I want to give, because we get this question a lot, is has to do with driving. So if a person has had a seizure and therefore has lost their driver's license for 3 months, or if they simply never got a driver's license to start with, whether or not driving is an essential function of the job really depends on what the job is. So a couple of examples: if someone wants to drive a taxi, be a taxi driver or an Uber driver, obviously an essential function of the job is driving. So if you're unable to drive due to your epilepsy, then you are not a qualified individual for that job, because you can't perform that essential function of driving. That's a really obvious one, but there are other areas where it's not maybe so obvious. So for example, someone works in a bank, and part of their responsibilities and their functions in that job is to, not works in a bank, but you work in a business, and at the end of the day, you're required to make bank deposits. Okay, let's go that way. So at the end of the day, you take the receipts and you're going to take all the cash to the bank. There are different ways you can get to the bank. You can drive, you can walk, take a taxi. So if you can't drive, that does not necessarily mean you can't fulfill that essential function of making those bank deposits, because there are other ways that you can get there. The essential function is making the bank deposit, not driving. Driving is just a means to get there. So again, that's an example of looking at what the essential functions are and determining whether any limitations posed by a person's epilepsy are really causing them not to be able to do an essential function, or are they just not able to do a task that could be done a different way. The next part of this is whether something would cause an undue burden to the employer, because they can refuse to provide an accommodation if that particular accommodation would present an undue burden. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means exactly. An accommodation can present an undue burden if it causes significant difficulty or expense to the employer, it's unduly extensive, substantial, or disruptive, it alters the nature or operation of the business. And there are no, again, there are no blanket statements that says this is an undue burden and this is not. It really is determined on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the resources and the circumstances that that particular employer has. So a multinational corporation with thousands of employees may have very different resources available to accommodate employees than a smaller mom and pop store does. So something that would be way too expensive for a very small business operation may not be, and would be an undue burden for that size of a business, may not be an undue burden for a larger corporation. So again, a lot depends on what the resources are and what the circumstances are of that particular employer. One thing to know is that an employer is not allowed to use the excuse of, well, if we make this accommodation for one person and we make an exception, we have to do it for everyone. That's not a valid reason to claim an undue burden. The requirement is there to accommodate employees unless that undue burden is so significant in difficulty or expense, or as I said, alters the nature or operation. An example of how an accommodation could possibly alter the nature or operation of a business. Let's say an individual, the business is a retail business, it's, a brick and mortar store, and the employee is working as a salesperson in that store. Asking to work from home would be an undue burden because the entire store is set up as a retail operation that needs employees to be on site. So allowing an employee to do that work from home would completely alter the nature of the operation of the business. So that would be something that could be considered an undue burden. There's a lot of different things, and again, it really has to be looked at individually. So how do we go about choosing accommodations? The first thing to know is that there are no blanket accommodations. And again, there is no list of accommodations that the ADA says, here are all the things that an employer has to provide to its employees who have disabilities. It has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. So there are some questions that we often recommend that employers think about when they're considering possible accommodations for their employees, but you can also consider them in thinking about what accommodations you personally might need in the workplace. And I should note that it is the employee's decision to request an accommodation from the employer. The employer is not required to offer an accommodation if the employee does not ask for it. And in fact, in some cases, they can get into trouble with that because there are rules around disclosure of disabilities. So the businesses are limited in what kinds of questions they can ask about an individual's disabilities. So if you want an accommodation and need an accommodation in order to do the job, it's up to you to request that accommodation, and it will require disclosure of your disability, of your epilepsy. So some of the questions to ask: what are the functional limitations of the person who asked for the accommodation? How does, when we're talking about epilepsy, how does the epilepsy limit certain functions that person is able to do? Does it create problems with memory? Does it create problems with cognition or being able to understand maybe written instructions or verbal instructions? Someone who has seizures at night, does that make them very tired so that they're working early in the morning would be difficult? So think about what limitations epilepsy puts on the individual, and then what specific job tasks are affected by those limitations. Think about whether there are workplace policies or procedures in place that negatively affect the person's ability to do the job. So if you're struggling in the workplace, look at what some of the policies and procedures are that may be adding to those struggles, and perhaps an accommodation could be made to those policies and procedures that would help you to better do the job. What types of equipment are used or are needed to perform the job, and is that posing a difficulty? Your doctor or your neurologist can play an important role in accommodation process. However, having your doctor write a note and handing that to your employer doesn't necessarily constitute asking for an accommodation. So they can have a role to play because they can help to legitimize your request for an accommodation, but it is not just that they're just having a note from your doctor saying he can't do this or she can't do this. It is not going to be enough. If you are going to ask your doctor for input on reasonable accommodations, providing them with a copy of your job description can be really helpful, because that can help them in determining what kind of, of knowing what you're facing, what challenges you're facing on the job, and how accommodations might be able to help. To be in a successful accommodation, there are a few things that have to happen, two major things. One, it has to be effective by allowing the employee to perform the essential functions of the job. And two, it has to not create an undue hardship. Now, you will notice on here, it doesn't say that a successful accommodation has to be the best accommodation, the most expensive accommodation, or even the preferred accommodation of the employee. Ultimately, the employer gets to choose which accommodation they're going to provide. And it does not have to be the one that the employee would prefer. It just has to be effective in permitting the employee to perform the essential functions of the job, and it has to not create that undue hardship. So let's go and do another poll question here real quick. Okay. And this one's about reasonable accommodations, to see just how much you know about reasonable accommodations. Which of these would not be considered a reasonable accommodation? Being allowed to bring a seizure dog to work, taking breaks outside the regularly scheduled times, working from home, working part-time but getting paid for a full-time schedule, or being provided with a safety harness to avoid falls. So if you could just click on which one of those that you believe would not be considered a reasonable accommodation. I'll give you a few seconds to make sure everyone has a chance to vote. Okay, it looks like everyone has voted, and we'll pull that up. And you're all very well versed in accommodations. Either that or you have lucky guesses or it just made sense to you. But yes, working part-time but getting paid for a full-time schedule is not something that's going to be considered a reasonable accommodation. Even if you're a salaried employee, which, the salaried employees often have some flexibility in setting their hours, but they also still have an expectation of a certain amount of time that they have to work. Okay. So when it comes to accommodations, there are three general categories that we look at. One is a change in procedure or policy, which is how the job's done. The other is modification of the workplace itself. And the third is provision of some kind of assistive equipment. So we're going to take a look at some possible examples of accommodations for workers under each of those categories, specifically for workers with epilepsy. So the first one, changes to procedure or policy. What could this look like? It might look like asking if you can take breaks to take medication. And maybe those breaks are happening outside of the normal break time because of your medication schedule. That would be a change in the usual break policy. Having leave available to seek treatment or recuperate from treatment. Maybe you're having surgery, or maybe you're just needing time to adjust to a new medication. So asking for that leave. Now that leave does not have to be paid leave, but maybe you're in a job where there's only so much leave available, and this could give you, or maybe you're in a job that doesn't offer paid leave at all. In that case, asking for some unpaid leave even to have time to make that adjustment can be considered a reasonable accommodation. Having a private area where you can go and rest if you have a seizure on the job. Asking to have a consistent start time, if that's something that is, if a consistent work schedule is important in controlling your seizures, then asking to have that consistent start time can make a difference, or to have a change to your schedule. If you have nocturnal seizures, switching from a night shift to a day shift might be a good accommodation to ask for. Or even if working those odd schedules makes it more likely for you to have seizures, you could ask for an accommodation to have a more consistent schedule or to change from night to day. Permission to bring a service animal to work, that was one of our poll options, and yes, that can be an accommodation. And then reassignment to a vacant position if they're unable to accommodate in your current position. And that would probably be a last resort. Most people would rather keep the job that they have than be reassigned, but it is an option as a last resort. Other things that could be asked for are just altered work hours. Let's say your job starts super early in the morning, or goes into the evening, and you can't drive and you rely on public transportation, and the public transportation isn't available during those hours. Then you might ask to have your work hours altered so that you're able to access the public transportation that's available. Telecommuting, working from home, and that's a big one. And if there is one good thing that we're hoping might come out of this COVID epidemic, it is that the option to work from home may become more common now that employers have seen that it can be done in many jobs during the pandemic where they didn't think it could be done before. It was always very easy for an employer to say, no, that's not a job that can be done from home. But during this pandemic, we've learned that a lot of jobs can be done from home. I'm doing mine from home right now. So we are hoping that this might that this work from home option may be something that is more available going into the future, even once COVID goes away. Back to the reassignment, one thing that's important to know is if you are reassigned to, if you do seek reassignment to a vacant position, you still have to be qualified for that position. They can't just reassign you to a job you're not qualified for. And when reassignment is considered, they're supposed to try to find a job that's open, that has similar pay and a similar status or rank. But if a job like that is not available, that's similar in status and pay to your current job, the employer can offer that lower rank or pay if that's the only option they have. They are not required to create a new position, and they are not required to bump someone else or remove another employee to create a vacancy for you. So for the other two categories, workspace modification. Here's another example, a few more examples of workspace modification. Maybe they will let you put down a rubber mat, or they'll put down a carpet in the area where you work in case you fall, so it's more cushioned. Maybe if your seizures are triggered by temperature extremes, providing a fan to keep it from getting too hot, or a heater to keep it from getting too cold, might be something an employer could do as an accommodation. Some people's seizures are affected by fluorescent lights, so There are fluorescent light tube covers that can be purchased to put over those lights to help with that. White noise machines, if someone is, I'm thinking of those in cases where maybe there are some cognitive issues due to the epilepsy, and a person is easily distractible. Sometimes white noise machines can help with that. Assistive equipment can be things from the very simple to the really more expensive and complex. At the simple end, maybe it's just a checklist to help remember what tasks you're supposed to do if you're having issues with memory. Personal safety and fall alert devices. So this could be something like a harness to keep you from falling. It could also be some sort of alert device that is triggered if you fall. So that, and that's especially if you're working in a job where you're not around other people. Maybe you're working in a remote area of a warehouse or something like that, having that there, or having a walkie-talkie or some sort of personal communication device that you can alert other people if something happens, especially if you have seizures where you have an aura and you have some warning. There are apps for all kinds of things, concentration, memory, time management, organization, allowing you to use those apps and providing you with the opportunity to do that could be an accommodation. If you're someone who is having cognitive issues in terms of understanding written word, the written communication, then maybe having the computer that you're working with have a speech output so that you can receive communications verbally that you can hear through the computer rather than having to read them. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many, many other options. This is just to kind of spark some ideas for you on some of the things that have worked for other people with epilepsy. They're just some examples to use kind of as a taking off point for you. I do want to spend a little time talking about some case studies. And some of these have come from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They have a document, a really great document that is referred to at the end of this webinar on epilepsy in the workplace. Some of these are actually based on phone calls that I've received. The names have been created. These are not real people's names. So, but the first one I want to start with, and again, this is just to kind of give you an idea of what accommodations can look like in the real world, in the workplace. So the first one involves a librarian, Ellen, and she has epilepsy, and her library schedules their employees to work 8-hour shifts, starting as early as 8 a.m. and as late as 1 p.m. And Ellen has nocturnal seizures. And so she has a lot of trouble getting up in the morning because she's tired from these seizures. So an 8 o'clock shift is really difficult for her to handle. So as an accommodation, she requests that her shifts start either in the late morning or in the early afternoon. The library, her employer, takes a look at their staffing levels, and they decide that they have enough staff available between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. that Ellen doesn't need to be there during those hours. They can staff those hours with other people, and the public will still be served. It will not hurt their business and their ability to serve their clients at all. So they grant that accommodation. And again, remember the two criteria. It has to be effective. It allows Ellen to perform her essential job function. She comes in at 10 a.m. feeling much more refreshed and able to do her job. And it doesn't create any undue burden on the employer. The second one I want to look at is Jim, who works in a factory packing boxes. And he frequently has absence seizures. And so those seizures just make him forget what he was doing before they happened. They don't last long, but it does create an issue because he'll be packing a box and suddenly he realizes he's had an absence seizure and now he can't remember where he is in what he's supposed to be doing. So as an accommodation, very simple one, he asks that his supervisor provide him with a checklist for every step of the job. As he goes along, he checks off what he's done. So Is it effective? Yes. When he has a seizure, he can look at that checklist to see what steps he's already completed, and he can then continue on with the list. Lets him fulfill the essential functions of his job, presents absolutely no burden really on the employer, and certainly not an undue burden on the employer. The third one I want to talk about involves another factory worker, Bob, and he has memory loss due to his epilepsy. And because of that, he really relies on the reminder app on his phone to take his medication on schedule. If he does not have access to that app, he tends to forget to take his medication and tends to be quite likely to have a seizure on the job. The problem is that Bob's employer has a no cell phone policy. They do that because they want to employ and promote employee productivity. They don't want their employees being out on the factory floor, being on their phones all the time. As an accommodation, Bob requests that he be allowed to keep his cell phone in his pocket, making an exception to policy. As you remember, that's one of the three categories of accommodations is an exception to policy. His employer thinks about it and agrees that they will provide that requested accommodation on one condition, and that is that Bob does not look at the phone unless the reminder goes off. So if he is caught out on the floor playing games on his phone or talking on his phone or doing any of the million things we can do to waste time on our phones, then the accommodation will be retracted. So Bob agrees it's effective. Again, two things. Is it effective? Does it create an undue burden? Yes, it's effective. He gets those reminders he needs to take his medication. That allows him to remain seizure-free. That allows him to fulfill those essential functions of his job. And it does not present any kind of undue burden for the employer. Now, you might ask what happens when all of his coworkers see that he has his phone and no one else has their phone. Again, it goes back to the employer is not allowed to say, oh, well, if we do it for one person, we have to do it for everybody else, and so it creates an undue burden. No. In what we suggest to employers is that they train their employees well in the ADA and what is required. And if an employee complains, they are not allowed to discuss Bob's epilepsy, his disability at all, but they at that point can just say, we treat each individual according to what their needs are, and keep in mind that we would provide you, the employee who's complaining, with the same consideration. And that's the end of it. And the final case study I want to talk about, and this is one of Bob was a real case, even though that was not his name, and Sue, also not her real name, is another actual case that we worked with. Sue was a radiation therapist, and she has seizures that are triggered by flashing lights. The hospital where she works has purchased new equipment that includes a strobe light. So the first thing Sue asks for as an accommodation is that she be able just to continue using the current equipment and not have to switch to the new equipment. Sue's employer denies that as an undue burden because this new equipment is the newest and the most effective, and by allowing her to use old equipment, it would prevent them from providing the best care for their patients and harm their ability to compete with other hospitals. So that accommodation was denied. But Sue then asked if it was possible. And this situation went back and forth for a little while. So when I talk about how this is all, sometimes it seems nice and neat. It's not always a straight line. Sometimes there's some back and forth, and that's the way the accommodation process is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the employer and the employee working together to come up with a solution. So after some discussion and some ideas that didn't seem like they were going to work, Sue asked if she could be transferred to a different department within the hospital where strobe lights were not used. The hospital was actually able to find an open position that Sue was qualified for, which was equivalent to her current pay and equivalent in status to her current job. And she transferred over into the new department. She's now able to fulfill the essential functions of her new position. And there was no undue burden on the employer because that position was already open. So again, these are just examples. There's a wonderful organization called the Job Accommodations Network, or JAN, and they are great for ideas on how to on what types of accommodations might fit specific situations, and that is a free service that they offer. There's more information about them in the reference slides at the end of this webinar. Okay, I think this is our final poll question. So let's get this pulled up here. And this is an easy true or false one. Once I've disclosed my epilepsy, it's up to my employer to figure out an accommodation that will help me. Is that true or is that false? I'll give everybody a few seconds to select. Okay, it looks like you're all done. That was pretty quick, so it seems like everybody's pretty confident that yes, it is false. And I'm glad to see that you've been paying attention. It is the employer's responsibility to provide an accommodation, but it is not their sole responsibility to figure it out. So asking for an accommodation goes beyond saying, hey, I'm having this problem, you need to fix it for me. It's the employer and the employee working together to come up with solutions that work. It is a process. So let's talk about that process and how it works. Who can make that request of accommodations? The employee certainly can. And in most cases, that's what's going to happen, is that the employee is going to request. But the ADA does allow other people to request an accommodation on behalf of the employee. It can be a family member, a friend, a health professional, or another representative. But as I said, in most cases, it's going to be the employee initiating the request. Who should you make the request to? That's going to depend on your own company. Human resources is one place that might be. If your company doesn't have a human resources person, it might be the supervisor who's responsible for your position. Some organizations have a disability services unit or office. So, it's a good idea to find out where those accommodations requests go. The form of the request, it's not required that you put the request in writing, but it is strongly recommended. The ADA does not require it, but it's always good to have documentation just in case. I always say, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And if you, for some reason, your employer doesn't cooperate and you aren't able to get the accommodation, you will at least have that paper trail. Showing that, yes, you did put in writing your request for accommodations. Some employers are going to have their own paperwork, and if that's the case, then you should use their paperwork. You want to follow the procedures they have in place. Others may not, and you may just want to write a letter. We do have a sample accommodation letter, and I will send that out along with this PowerPoint so that you're all able to use that just as a guide. It certainly doesn't have to be copied word for word. It's going to depend on your own circumstances, but it'll give you some ideas of some things to put in there. And when you do file your request for accommodations, make sure you keep a copy for your own records, just in case. When to make the request? Really, as soon as you realize that you need it. Sometimes people are reluctant to request, partly because maybe they don't want to disclose their epilepsy, or because they don't want to be seen as, asking for any kind of special accommodations. But really, you don't want to wait until your performance has started to suffer, or there are conduct problems related to your epilepsy that you're going to have to explain. Just as soon as you realize that there is some sort of barrier in the workplace that's preventing you, because of your epilepsy, from effectively competing for a job. Remember, this applies not just in the workplace, but also when you're applying for a job, from performing a job, or it's preventing you from gaining access to some benefit of employment. It can be something as simple as, well, back in the day when we were all together at work, it could be something as simple as, this isn't related to epilepsy, but an employee with in a wheelchair and the company's holding their Christmas party somewhere that's not accessible. So again, that's a benefit of employment. You should be able to access those same benefits. So, and also keep in mind that accommodations can be temporary, or they can be permanent. It's everything about accommodations is specific to the individual. If something changes in the future, maybe you're getting a service dog that you didn't have before, and now you need to ask if you can bring it to work. Or you have a change in medication and you need that time off to adjust. You can always ask for additional accommodations. Some people will require multiple accommodations in order to do their job effectively. Or you can ask that one accommodation be stopped and a new one started if you have a new need. What you include in your request, it's really, it is a process, and there are no magic words there that you can use. You don't even have to use the words reasonable accommodations. What you need to do, we usually recommend that you do, but it's not required by the ADA. You want to state in very plain language that you need an accommodation and that you need it because of your epilepsy, and be very specific regarding the link between the accommodation that you're requesting and the epilepsy. An example of that would be, maybe you're going back to temperature extremes. Maybe your office is hot and that is leading to the possibility of increased seizure activity. If you just go to your employer or even send them a letter and say, I would like to request a fan in my office as an accommodation because my office is too hot, that's not a valid request for an accommodation, because it doesn't link the need for the accommodation with your epilepsy. So instead, you might want to say, I need to request a fan in my office as a reasonable accommodation because when the office gets too hot, it can trigger a seizure. You've got to make that link between the accommodation requested and the epilepsy. Make sure when you do request an accommodation that you ask to get a response by a specific deadline. Many employers are very willing to work with people on accommodations. There will be some who will think that they can just ignore it. If you put a date in there, it gets harder to ignore. And then you're able to come back later and say, if you do end up having to file a complaint, you then have dates, and you can say, I asked for a response by this date, I didn't get it. Some other things to keep in mind: not every employee with epilepsy is going to require an accommodation. So just because they're out there, if you don't need one, if you can do your job without one, great, don't request one. Some employees may need more than one. We already talked about the fact that they can be new accommodations can be requested as the employee's needs change. And requesting the accommodation is only a first step. Again, this is a process. And it's an interactive process. So the employer's response, ideally, this should be a discussion, not a demand. Okay, and that's important to keep in mind, because sometimes how you approach it can influence how your employer responds. They are allowed to request documentation, medical documentation, but it's limited. They can only ask it to confirm the disability, so to confirm that you have epilepsy, and to confirm that an accommodation is needed. They can't go asking for your full medical records. Not allowed to do that under the ADA. Again, the employer gets to choose which accommodation they're going to provide, and it does not have to be what you consider the best or what you would prefer. It just has to be effective and not create an undue burden. And the employer is not required to eliminate essential job functions or disregard performance standards. So, if they give you the accommodation and you still are not able to show the same productivity or do the essential functions of your job, even with an accommodation, you can try a different accommodation. But if multiple accommodations are tried and nothing can be found that lets you do those job functions to the performance standards that are expected of everyone else on that job, then you can be let go in that point. The ADA is not a total and complete protection from ever losing a job. And there are no times, unfortunately, there are times when no effective accommodation can be found. And in that case, the employee can be let go. So what do you do if the employer just refuses or just doesn't respond? Well, if they don't respond, send a follow-up. And again, in the follow-up, put a new date that you want to hear from them by. Keep that paper trail, keep that documentation. If they refuse to provide an accommodation that you've asked for because they say it would not be effective or it would be an undue burden, attempt to negotiate a different one. Again, it's a process. It can be a back and forth, and sometimes it can take some time to find an accommodation that's acceptable to the employer and the employee both. Consult with JAN, the Job Accommodations Network, for ideas, because sometimes they can come up with ideas that you and your employer may not have considered. If the employer absolutely refuses to participate in the process, that is when you need to go and start thinking about what your options are. There are two organizations in Minnesota. The ADA Minnesota is a wonderful organization. I have contact information at the end of this webinar for the woman who is the manager there. Her name is Cindy Tarshish, and she is great at trying to help you look at the situation, kind of an outside, non-partial or impartial third party who can really look at it. She knows a lot about what the ADA does and does not require, and can let you know whether what your employer's refusal is something that would justify filing a complaint. If she can't be reached, the Great Lakes ADA Center is the larger organization that serves a more regional area. I don't have an individual contact name there, but they would be another option. You can then, if you like, you can file a complaint. If you feel that you're being discriminated against based on your epilepsy, you can file a complaint either with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. There are timelines for filing those complaints. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the federal agency, and they enforce laws against employment discrimination under the ADA. You have 180 days from the time that the discrimination occurred to file a complaint. If there's also a state agency that enforces a law prohibiting discrimination under the same circumstances, then that deadline for the EEOC filing can go up to 300 days. And again, remember, the ADA applies to employers who have 15 or more employees. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights is the agency that enforces the state law against employment discrimination. And they provide a period of up to a year to file a complaint. And they cover employees of any size. These agencies do cooperate with each other in processing claims. So you can go to either one, and if they feel that one of the others should get involved, they will help make that happen. We always hope it doesn't come to this, filing a complaint. Many employers are more than happy to provide a reasonable accommodation if they're able to. So as you're thinking about accommodations, consider your functional limitations, if you have any, and how they affect your employment. Consider what possible accommodations you might need, and ask for help if needed in figuring out what those are. Request your accommodation and work with the employer to get it, and know your rights. And if you believe they're being violated, seek help from one of these organizations. That is the end of the formal part of this. I do want to remind you about our Information Services Department, that we do provide free one-on-one support with customized tools and resources on all kinds of epilepsy topics. So we also have written materials, so you can feel free to request those from me as well. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need help. Our mission statement, we're all about trying to help people overcome the challenges of living with epilepsy. Our general contact information is here. If anyone is ever willing or interested in making a donation to help us continue the work that we do, we always appreciate those. And there's a place on our website here where those can be made. These are the references that I was talking about earlier. The contact information for Jan, for ADA Minnesota, the Great Lakes ADA Center, the EEOC, and the Department of Human Rights. All of that information is here for you. So that being said, we do have a few minutes left to answer any questions that might have come in during this. I hope that you've been typing in questions as we go. If not, go ahead and type them in now. Again, click on that Q&A. I do have a few here, so I'll start answering those and then we'll see if any more come in. What happens if my employer offers me an accommodation that's different from the one I asked for? Do I have to accept it? Again, as I said earlier, it's a process. So if it's an accommodation that you don't feel is going to be effective and is not going to work for you, you certainly have the right to ask the employer to try a different accommodation. Your employer may also come back to you and say, well, let's try this one and just see what happens. And rather than just dismiss it as not being effective right out of hand. Again, though, keep in mind, they are not required to provide you with the exact accommodation you want and you feel would be best. It just has to be effective in allowing you to do your job. So obviously, in most cases, employers are going, they're going to choose the one that's the easiest for them to implement and the one that is the least expensive for them to implement. But if it's effective, then they have the right to do that. Do you have to accept it? Well, no, but you do run the risk if my suggestion would be is if you don't want to accept it, that you have another alternative in mind to suggest. Because it can reach a point where if there are no effective accommodations can be found that both you and your employer can agree on, then it could come down to you not being employed there anymore. Because you do have to be able to do the job with or without an accommodation. Got another one here. Is there a deadline for filing a complaint against a former employer? There are no special rules, as far as I'm aware, for former employers. The 180 days if you're filing with the EEOC or the, what did I say it was? Now I've already forgotten what it is, the guidelines. 180 days or the 1 year, yes, for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. So it goes from the time of the last the last time that the violation occurred or that the discrimination occurred. So if you were let go from a job and you feel that it was in violation of the ADA or the state laws on discrimination in employment, then you need to make sure to file a complaint within those deadlines, 180 days under the ADA or the 1 year under human rights. But yeah, it's not just current employers that you can file complaints about. You can file them against former employers as long as you do it within those guidelines, within those timeframes. Can I get my employer to buy me a seizure alert device as a reasonable accommodation? I'm assuming that what you're talking about here is one of the like wearable devices, like the Embrace bracelet or wearable or watch or whatever you want to call it, that will detect seizure activity. The answer is probably going to be no, that the employer would not be required to provide that as a reasonable accommodation, simply because that is a device that can also be used outside of work, and the employer is only responsible for providing you with an accommodation for the workplace. So maybe if you agreed to leave that device at work in a locker or something, and only used it on the job, then maybe they might consider that. But again, I would think most employers are going to say no, that that's a personal device that you are using outside of work, and we're not going to pay for it. So, see if there's any others. Okay, that seems to be all the questions. So I do appreciate you attending tonight. I hope that you got some good information that you'll be able to take and use in your own employment situation. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions at all. And again, I will be sending out this PowerPoint along with that sample accommodations letter, and you should be receiving that within the next 3 days. Thanks again for attending, and you all have a wonderful evening.